per second and bounces first time. A closer look at the physics shows how the water repels the ball.
First of all, if we look at why critical speed is important, if we take the ball and try and move it through the water, we can see that at a low speed, the particles of water, the molecules are moving around and they're getting out of the way of the sphere and they're flowing around it. And if we increase our speed to beyond the critical speed, we'll find that the water effectively acts as a solid, and that if we hit it fast enough, the ball can't penetrate it at all.
The ball continues on its path, bouncing 5 times over 1,000 feet.
If we zoom in and take a look at what's happening at the contact point, we can see that the cannonball has scored a long trench in the water, and the water's piling up in front of it. And at the last point of contact here is we're going to have forces acting on it. One component of the force is going to be a drag, which is acting this way. That's going to slow the cannonball down. But we have another factor, which is the upwards force, which is called lift. And if that force is great enough, it will actually throw the ball out of the water, and we can see it carrying on its journey here. And that will allow it to carry on and potentially make further bounces further on down the water.
The ball may have bounced, but it didn't hit the target. Any ship would have sailed away to safety. This calls for a recalculation of the elevation of the cannon.
They had fine directional stability, but it went too high, 1 or 2 more meters above, and then it went down and bounced. Beautiful. It was a beautiful shot, but so we have to correct it now, get it maybe half a degree down.
Half a degree down? Yeah. I think down a little bit. Down
but not much. Not much.
Yeah.
Once adjusted, the cannon is fired again. Once again, the ball can be clearly seen bouncing across the surface of the water. This time it smashes into the target, driving a 6-inch hole through the solid wood.
That was amazing and a bit lucky. What do you say?
Oh, yeah. Just down at the bottom right there?
Yeah, it went to the right and it had hit the water in front of the target, and then it bounced 5 or 6 times.
Yeah.
Quite amazing.
Yeah.
Our investigation has proved that it is possible to bounce cannonballs across water and hit a target.
It must definitely have been able to do this. It's just completely... It's taken us a few shots to get it right, but it's definitely... They must have been able to do this.
On the Bosphorus, this tactic was soon put to the test. On the 25th of November 1452, just 3 months after the fortress of Rumeli Hisar was completed, a Venetian trading ship refused orders to stop and was fired upon.
So if you can imagine what you would actually see if you were on a ship and someone had fired this towards you, it would take many, many seconds for the... you'd see the flash of the cannon, a little while later you'd hear the bang, and then you'd see perhaps a few dots on the water, and then bang, there'd be a hole in your ship.
The ship was sunk and its 30-man crew executed. From then on, it was clear that the Turks were masters of the Bosphorus.
In effect, shipping up and down the Bosphorus became extremely dangerous, and you risked your life if you were trying to pilot a ship through that throat cutter, as it was called. It really was a stranglehold on shipping.
Within a few months, Constantinople was ripe for the taking. In 1453, Mehmet laid siege to the city. Without its principal supply route, the city held out for just 8 weeks before falling to the Turkish onslaught.
It was a stage in the Ottoman conquest of the known world. They had to capture Constantinople, and once they had, they went on to attack and besiege many other great capitals.
Aerial warfare took many forms in the ancient world. From kite bombs to bouncing bombs, each weapon struck fear in the enemy. But some airborne assault weapons took this ambition even further. They were designed to control the whole battle, using only the power of sound.
So if you're in the middle of a battle, and then suddenly you hear this high-pitched whistling, screeching sound, you know from experience that these things are going to be hitting you any second, literally a split second.
These arrowheads are unlike any others ever produced. Too large to fly aerodynamically, too blunt to inflict serious injury, these projectiles unlock the secrets of how ancient Chinese battlefield commanders spoke to their troops in the days before radios.
The main use of whistling arrows was as signal devices, a sort of early version of the flares that are used on today's battlefields.
Ancient China in the 2nd century AD. In the remote reaches of Mongolia lived a nomadic people known as the first Khans of Xiongnu, led by a warrior chief named Miedan. Ancient legends say that Miedan deployed whistling arrows. Few people know more about these arrows than Stephen Selby. He traveled to the farthest reaches of China in his hunt for this legendary device. Remarkably, he discovered an actual whistling arrowhead.
This is an original arrowhead. It's about 2,000 years old, and it comes from north of China, probably the area that was occupied by the Xiongnu. And although it's so old and it's made of bronze, it'll probably still whistle quite well. We can have a try.
Legends say that Miedan used the piercing sound of whistling arrows to send signals to his troops in the heat of battle.
The story goes that Miedan invented the whistling arrow, and then he directed his troops to kill whatever the arrow went near. He fired the arrow to his favorite hunting dog. Some of the troops went over and killed the dog, but some of them were too afraid. The ones who were afraid were killed. Finally, he fired the arrow to where his father was standing, and all the troops rushed over and killed his father.
Miedan swept through southern China. Armed with whistling arrows, he was able to control his troops like a puppet master.
For the general on the battlefield, he couldn't be in the thick of the battle. He had to be at a high location, overlooking the formations.
The stories say that Miedan could send signals to troops up to half a mile away. But could a bronze whistle like the one Stephen found really make enough noise to be heard above the clamour of battle?
Well, I've spent a lot of time making pipe organs and making whistles and pipes of various sorts. So this was actually quite an interesting challenge to work out exactly how these things operate. And basically, it's like most whistles. We've got a sound chamber. These can be quite small, which will give a very, very high-pitched shrill sound. The bigger they are, the lower the pitch will be.
Richard has been able to work out how the sound is produced.
The air is rushing over that hole there. It's hitting an angle, which is this little device we call the fipple. The air is caused to move inside the fipple, causing a build-up of pressure on the inside.
Air rushing through the hole in a whistle pressurizes the air in the chamber. This causes the molecules to vibrate rapidly, creating an audible sound. In a whistling arrow, the vibrations are so vigorous that the sound is heard as a high-pitched screech. Could this ingenious application of basic physics produce a loud enough sound to change the tide of battle? At Cranfield Weapons Testing Facility near Swindon, Stephen Selby will put the whistling arrow to the test. He's rigged up a decibel meter to gauge any change in audio level.
We've fixed up this sound meter here, and it's on the wall just at the place where the arrow is going to fly past. And it'll continuously measure the sound, but when it reaches the loudest level of sound, it'll just freeze there, and then after the test we're going to be able to read off what the maximum sound level was.
Richard's arrow has produced a loud whistle.
This meter here has given a reading of 86 decibels, and I think that that's quite good and loud, and it should have made a pretty good impression on the battlefield.
This is over the legal noise limit for motorcycles in Britain and the whole of Europe. But Miedan did not stop at sound.
Sometimes what they did was they'd use a whistling arrow, and round this they would wrap cotton or hemp or something of that nature soaked in oil, set fire to it, and then fire the arrow to the point of pressure where the archers needed to fire to.
Most military systems have a backup known as redundancy. Thus, Miedan complemented the whistle with a visual cue: fire.
I think it would have really made an impression on the battlefield. You could definitely hear that a long way away, and with more time travelling further, I think it would have been a very good signal.
Our experiments have shown how these arrows both unnerved the enemy and revolutionized the way troops are commanded in battle.
A battlefield is terribly confused. It's terrifying. Even before firearms, there was smoke. There would be dust. There would be rain. There would be mist. All sorts of confusing situations. An arrow that flew over with a sound and a smoke signal was a very clear signal compared to anything that was happening at ground level.
The whistling arrows were a means of directing troops in battle. But to rain down destruction from the air, ancient commanders had to wait until the invention of gunpowder and the rocket. It was a device that struck fear on the battlefields of medieval China. A winged bird flying at a speed unseen in nature. It was called the magic flying crow.
The fact that an explosive charge was carried inside the flying crow and was intended to be detonated suggests that it was originally conceived as a weapon of mass destruction.
The magic flying crow is described in an extraordinary ancient Chinese text dating from the late 14th century, the Fire Drake Artillery Manual.
It is basically the model of a bird, complete with wings and tail, propelled by 4 rockets. These drive it into the vicinity of the enemy and then ignite an explosive charge inside the device. So it's an early version of a modern artillery rocket.
Were the Chinese the first to develop effective military rockets over 700 years ago? Did they have the technology? Modern rocketeer Ben Jarvis is investigating stories of what could be history's first rocket warheads. He's recreated a magic crow using the precise dimensions and descriptions in the Fire Drake Manual.
The wings of the crows would have been made out of a lightweight wood such as balsa wood or basswood, and they probably would have carved them to give them a slight aerofoil. The purpose of this would have been to actually allow the crows to glide for a greater distance after the rocket engines had stopped burning.
Ben has unearthed evidence of an aerodynamic design.
It's quite impressive that they were actually able to realise the importance of having a tail in order to aid stability.
The ancient Chinese engineers powered their device with a mixture they called fire chemical, that we know as gunpowder.
It was the Chinese who originally invented gunpowder. It's actually a fairly simple combination of saltpeter or potassium nitrate mixed with sulphur and charcoal.
The Chinese developed an ingenious technique of transforming gunpowder into rocket fuel.
This is a simple gunpowder rocket engine. When compressed under high pressure, gunpowder becomes basically like a solid block, and it can then be lit and it will burn from one end to the other in a controlled fashion rather than just going bang.
Computer scientist James Dean has modelled how this explosive fuel was able to power the ancient Chinese rocket, based on the specifications in the Fire Drake Manual.
Let's take a look at an ancient Chinese rocket and see how it might work. Here you can see there's a body of a rocket, and contained within it we've got some solid fuel. And the principle is that when we ignite the solid fuel, it's going to very rapidly create a lot of gas, which has a much higher volume than the solid fuel that we started with. So if we take a look back at the wider scale, we can see the rocket body, and let's see what happens when we ignite the fuel. And you can see that it's producing a lot of high pressure inside. And so effectively the body is pressing on the gas and ejecting it out the back. And because of the principle of every action having an equal and opposite reaction, the gas in turn applies a force to the body, which is what accelerates the rocket and makes it travel off in a straight line.
This simple principle of physics powered the rocket and its deadly payload.
The crows were hollow, made from bamboo, and were probably packed completely full of loose gunpowder, probably in a fairly coarse mixture, so that when the fuse from the rocket engines burnt through into it, it would cause a huge fireball to set fire to whatever it was being aimed at. We've done all the work we can. We've built what is hopefully a fairly accurate historical representation of one of these exploding crows. All we can do now is go and see whether or not the world's earliest crew